Good. All right. So basically, maybe I'll backtrack a little bit and I'll just say that I'm going to be presenting work on searches learning, and it is different from prior work, I think, because it looks at the learning process. This is a study in which we essentially are trying to figure out if somebody's meeting a specific type of learning objective, what is the trajectory that they take towards meeting that objective. Let's see, I'm going to be introducing the Anderson and Kraftwerk taxonomy, which is something we've used to both manipulate search tasks and as well as characterizing pathways. Then I'll define what a pathway is, and then finally I'll describe the study, give you some results and opportunity for future work. In the interest of time, I'm going to basically only focus on the fourth research question, which was looking at the types of pathways that people followed towards the objective that they were asked to pursue. And again, I'm going to introduce that. So for those of you who haven't heard about the Anderson and Kraftwerk taxonomy, this comes from the field of education. And it's a taxonomy that was developed to help educators do three things. One is to define learning objectives for students, right? So for instance, if you're an educator and you want a student to meet a specific objective, you want that to be very clearly defined. You also want to be able to develop instructional activities that target the learning objective that you have in mind. And then finally, you want to be able to develop assessment materials that measure whether the student met the objective that you wanted. Okay, so people from education came up with this taxonomy to help educator students. The taxonomy says a learning objective is a verb-noun pair. Okay, the verb is the cognitive process of the objective, and the noun is the knowledge type. And so, for instance, imagine that you have, imagine that you're a teacher and you want your students to be able to do this. Right, the students will be able to distinguish between parliamentary democracy and presidential democracy. Right, that's a specific objective that you have for your students. Now that objective, the verb is distinguish. That means that it's at a cognitive process of analyze, which involves differentiating between things. And it involves conceptual knowledge because parliamentary democracy and presidential democracy are examples of conceptual knowledge, right? Categories that we use to make sense of the word. And so the taxonomy really is a two-dimensional taxonomy. So one dimension is the cognitive process, and those things range from simple to complex. And there are 6 categories. So remember is being able to regurgitate or recall information verbatim without necessarily understanding it, right? So when you cram for an exam, that's remembering, right? Understand means that you're able to explain and summarize using your own words, right? So you internalize the information a little bit better. Apply means being able to use knowledge in a novel scenario. Analyze basically means being able to compare, contrast, and differentiate between multiple things. Evaluate means being able to judge, critique, and prioritize, and create means being able to generate new ideas. Right? So these are from simple to complex. The knowledge type involves 3 knowledge types that are sort of external and one that's internal. The 3 that are external are factual knowledge, so that is isolated bits of information, mostly objective. Conceptual, which is concepts, categories, and theories. Procedural, which is how-to knowledge, which involves things like algorithm processes and skills. And then metacognitive, which is internal, right? So metacognitive is how well you know something, right? Or knowing what works for you in terms of learning and what doesn't work for you, right? So that's metacognitive. And so if you're thinking about learning objectives, you can think of them as this two-dimensional taxonomy, right? And so it's a table where the rows are the knowledge type and the columns are the cognitive process. And so what people had done in the past in our field is that they had said, we can manipulate learning objective by using the cognitive process dimension. But they hadn't really either controlled for or manipulated the knowledge type dimension. And so what we did in this study is we said, what if we did both, right? So what if we give people 9 different types of tasks that vary along factual, conceptual, procedural, and apply, evaluate, and create. So that's the manipulation of the objective that we gave for instance. Okay. So I'm not gonna, we have 9 different task types, and so I'm not gonna describe them all, but maybe we can do 1 row and 1 column. For instance, in the factual row, we have, let's say, an apply objective would be, use fact X to better understand facts Y. Evaluate would be judge the importance of fact X in argument Y. And the create would be create a table of facts about X using your own organizational structure. And if we look at the evaluate column for a factual task, again, it would be judge the importance of fact X in argument Y. Conceptual would be judge whether concept X or Y best explains C. And then procedural would be judge whether procedure X or Y is best based on some criteria. Right, so that's the task one. Then comes the part of, if we've given you an objective that we want you to meet, how do we characterize the path that you took towards that objective? And so that's defining a pathway. And so this idea of a pathway is basically saying, imagine that we take a search session and we say a search session in the context of learning is a sequence of learning instances. And a learning instance is basically a point in the search where you either engaged in some new learning activity, you developed a new learning-oriented goal that you pursued, or you serendipitously learned something new. And so then what we can do is we can take those learning instances and we can also classify them into cells in the taxonomy. Okay, so that's a little bit complicated. So let me give you an example. Imagine that you're pursuing a learning objective like you want to judge whether concept X or Y best explains phenomenon C. Okay. This is something that a searcher might do. They might go directly to a web page that addresses this. Does X or Y best explain C? And they might look at that and say, I have no idea how, I don't understand this because I don't really understand X and Y well enough. And so what they might do is they might go and keep searching and read definitions of X, right? Because they need to understand X better. Then they might say, okay, now I need to look at definitions of Y. Then they might say, I don't understand the differences between X and Y. And so they go to a page where they look at similarities and differences between X and Y. Then they do this and they realize that they still don't understand Y well. And so they go back and they look at examples of Y. And then finally, they go back to the original page and they keep it checked. Hopefully that makes sense. There's a trajectory that they follow towards an objective. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand what that trajectory looks like. Okay. So we basically developed a study where we gave people, we designed 27 different learning-oriented search tasks that varied along 3 topical domains. Again, 3 cognitive processes, 3 knowledge types. The study involved 36 participants. Each participant completed 3 tasks, and the 3 tasks varied along the 3 cognitive processes and the 3 knowledge types within a specific domain. Okay, and this is if you all have. If you're not familiar with user studies, one thing that you can do in a user study is you can use a protocol that is called the think aloud protocol. But if you really want to learn about why people are doing what they're doing, you have them think out loud as they're searching. And it's a little bit awkward, but it tells you a lot about what's happening in the person's mind. And so we use the think aloud protocol and we record their screens. And after the fact, we analyze their searches in order to understand the pathways that they follow. Does that make sense? Okay. And so then we did a qualitative analysis of these pathways where we said, okay, we're going to represent the search session as a sequence of learning instances, and we're going to classify each learning instances into a cell in the taxonomy. And of course, when you do something like this manually, you have to measure agreement to sort of be able to convey that, that the process is sort of reliable. Okay, So now, on to results. One of the things that, so again, I'm basically just gonna give you a few of the trends that we observed in terms of the pathways that people followed. One of the things that we noticed is that much like this example that I gave you, when we gave people, let's say, a conceptual objective, they moved around the cognitive process dimension, but they tended to stay within the same knowledge type. And so what we did is we decided to analyze these pathways based on the cognitive processes traversed along the path. And I'm going to present results in tables that look like this, which is a little bit confusing, so let me unpack it. So you can think of these as Markov matrices, all right? So these are basically just the transition probabilities between cognitive processes. So for instance, and we're introducing a start state and an end state, right? There's the start of the session, the end of the session, and everything else is a transition probability from one cognitive process to another. So for example, if you take the first row, this says that when you start the session, you start with, there's an 18% probability that you're going to start with a remember objective and a 76% probability that you're going to start with the understand objective and a 0% chance that you're going to start with create, which is like the most complex, which makes sense. And the last column basically says just the count, which is the denominator used in all these probabilities. All right, so I'm going to give you some general trends observed. So if we don't care about the objective that we gave, right? So these are trends that are irrespective of the objectives. These are general trends. We observed, I guess, 5 things that I think are important. Now, these are, I've highlighted the probabilities that are above 14%, which would be the probability if everything was equally probable. That threshold is a little bit arbitrary, but that's just for the purpose of highlighting some of the trends that we see. So here are some of the trends. The first trend is that we tend to start with remember and understand, right? Which is not so surprising, right? When you start a learning-oriented search task, you start with low complex cognitive processes, right? You start with either memorization or understanding information well enough to summarize it in your own words. The other second trend is that we found that these probabilities along the diagonal are high, relatively speaking, which means that we tend to iterate on the same cognitive process multiple times. Well, that's like saying if you're trying to understand a concept, what might happen is you'll go and you'll read a definition of the concept, you won't understand it, so you'll look for another definition. And then you'll look for an example of the concept. And then you'll want an example of the concept from a different perspective, right? So we tend to iterate on the same cognitive process. The other thing that it's interesting, I think, is that we tend to transition from remember to understand, understand to analyze, and analyze to evaluate. That means that, if you think about sort of how we learn, right, we go from memorization to internalizing what we've read, right, so that we can actually explain it to ourselves and to others. It means that we often go from understanding things in isolation to understanding how they relate to other things, right? So if you're trying to understand some concept, that usually leads to understanding how that concept relates to other concepts, right? And then analyze to evaluate also makes sense because we often go from understanding how things are different from one another to basically evaluating them, right? If you're trying to decide between different alternatives, a prerequisite to that is understanding how the alternatives are different. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that we tend to see common transitioning from high complexity processes to low complexity processes, right? So these we call them these downshift transitions. And so if you think about it, you might think that this idea of learning is going from simple to moderately complex to highly complex, and then we finish, right? But what this says is, no, when you're trying to learn, oftentimes we bite more than we can chew, right? As we say in the US, which means that you try to pursue some objective that is, and then you realize you have to actually go back and deepen your understanding of other things in order to go forward, right? So I think that that's interesting. And then, create tends to be one of the final objectives, which makes sense because it's the most common. Okay, we also looked at these transition matrices for factual objectives, conceptual objectives, and procedural objectives. And the thing, I'm just going to tell, one trend for each. One is for factual objectives, there's a lot of remembering, which makes sense, right? Facts are usually isolated bits of information, so there's a lot of memorization involved. Understand objectives, there's a lot of understanding. Procedural objectives, we found two main trends. There's a lot of shifting to analyze and evaluate for less complex processes. And so if you think about sort of how-to tasks, there's a lot of analyzing how different approaches to a problem are different from one another. And there's a lot of sort of evaluating which one is best for you. And the other thing that we noticed with procedural objectives is that there's a lot of creativity, right? There's a lot of create-to-create transitions where, there's lots of approaches to a problem. Maybe you encounter one, you encounter another one, you combine them, you modify procedures, you skip steps. So if you think about every time you follow the recipe, you almost never follow it exactly as it's written, right? You always modify it to your own So that's basically it. In terms of opportunities for future work, I guess from a methodological standpoint, the Anderson and Kraftful taxonomy we found extremely useful, both for manipulating learning objectives and for analyzing pathways towards an objective. Based on our findings, I would recommend for researchers to consider the knowledge type dimension as well as the cognitive process dimension. And in our study, it had a big effect. And an open question for future work is, what are the characteristics of pathway that it might impact learning? There are opportunities for future work in terms of developing tools to support the learning process. And I am going to leave that for you to read in the paper because I'm out of time. But and we'll take questions if there's time for it.
So, although our goal was to be right on time, we had a huge technical glitch 10 minutes in. So I gave Jaime another 5 minutes. So that's just question time. So questions, there's one way.
Well, not a question, but I wanted to give you your kudos for such an excellent presentation before I started. And then my actual question is just sort of confirmed. So it seems that the whole learning process can vary greatly depending on when you start on that pathway. It seems like if you come in at the wrong spot, it'll definitely impact your outcome. And is this, I guess, about how many decades would you say this would be away from application to our education system?
I mean, I guess there's a few things here. Thank you for your question, first of all, but you said a few things that I think are interesting. One is, characteristics of the individual might impact where they start in a pathway, and I think that's entirely conceivable. This is not something that we've looked at. The other thing that we didn't look at in this paper is we didn't see how pathways impact learning at the very end, right? So we didn't give people like a learning assessment to figure out what are good pathways and what are bad pathways. And so that's an open question for future work. And in terms of developing tools to support pathways, I think there are simple things that we can do. I mean, for instance, this trend of, if you're trying to understand a concept, a very sensible next step is to understand how it differentiates from other related concepts. That's something that we could already do. You see what I mean? So like, if you're trying to understand a particular form of government, the next sensible step would be to understand how it's different from other forms of government. And so already we kind of know that that's going to happen. And then the other one is that there is this trend of sort of observing that people actually try to do something complex and then transition to having to do something less complex to deepen their understanding in order to be able to go back to that. So there's a lot of backtracking that I think in retrospect makes a lot of sense, because we kind of, the only way that we know that we don't know something is to try it. And then we realize that we don't know it. And then we go back to other things. And then we try it again. Yeah. So I think those are predictable behaviors that a search engine could expect.
Thank you for your response. Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Yes. Question. So how does I'm not sure if this has been done before, like how does knowledge base of a user affect learning pathways? When, like, for example, if you think of a PhD student or a more learned student, then will they have a different searching pathway than a person who's never seen the topic before? I would assume yes, but does it really affect the learning pathways?
I think that would be an interesting question to explore, but we don't know. Maybe that's something that you or we don't know. Yeah. We don't know how individual characteristics impact pathways necessarily. Yeah. Or whether there are certain pathways that are better than others. This was more about manipulating your objective and observing the differences in the pathways.
So I think we could there's one hand up remotely. So if you want to unmute and ask your question, we'll see if that'll work.
I'm unmuted. Thank you. So I find these results fascinating, Jaime. Thank you very much. And my question is, since you had to skip some details of your experimental design, your study, I would like to get a sense of how many participants is this data from? How many different tasks? Kind of what is the range? What is the scope of data that gave you this? They could create these transition matrices.
It's okay. Yes, thank you for that question. It was 36 participants, and each participant did 3 tasks. And all 3 tasks, while they were combinations, the 3 tasks involved every cognitive process and every knowledge type, but not all 9 combinations. And then we did the qualitative analysis of all of those 108 searches.
Okay, so you're gonna have to mull that over and hunt Jaime down afterward to ask him other questions. So we need to move on.
Okay.
To